Hello, jewelry lover. My name is Bella Naiman, and I'm the founder of New York City Jewelry Week. Welcome to this virtual program, part of NYCJW 24. The theme for the 7th annual edition is Wander and Wander, and it reflects the multifaceted nature of jewelry as both art and personal expression. Wander captures the awe-inspiring craftsmanship behind each piece, the dazzling, delicate, or bold details that turn your head in admiration. Wander invites you to explore the wonderful and wild creative journeys behind the jewelry. It's not just about the finished piece, it's about the adventure it took to get there. Designers experiment, push boundaries, and play with ideas and materials. And this year, New York City Jewelry Week takes participants to see it all unfold. Every necklace, ring, and bracelet is a passport to a new world where innovation reigns and imagination knows no limit. So we hope that these programs will take you on that journey and are your passport as well. Sit back, enjoy, and while these are not live, we welcome your comments. So please don't hesitate to drop us a line, whether it's email or Instagram, or even get in touch with some of the incredible curators, artists, writers that have really worked very hard to bring you this program. So thanks very much. And we also hope to see you out in New York. Bye.
Hello, everyone. I'm Glenn Adamson, and it's such a pleasure to be here with you virtually. I'm speaking to you from London, and in fact, I'm speaking to you from July, because this is recorded much earlier in the year than you're hearing it. But I do want to thank Bella for the kind introduction, and also Patty and the whole team at Gallery Loop, and also Chantel for helping to put this presentation together. It's a great honor to be speaking to you here about Attai Chen, who was, what can we say, a great jeweler, a great man, friend, and thinker. And what I'm going to be trying to do for you over the next 45 minutes is giving you a sense of his work, but also the thinking that lay behind the work. I've decided to call the talk Period I, which I'll explain in a minute. But the first thing that I wanted to say about Attai is that he had a particular way of looking and a particular electric connection between his close, careful looking and his equally careful making that I think was really unique and extremely powerful. And any of you who knew him and had the pleasure to talk to him about his work, and in fact, any of you who've even seen his work in person will understand the depth charge that his creativity had and remains having, even now that he's gone. So, as I say, a great privilege to be able to talk to you about him today. I thought I would start with these works, which are kind of prayer beads in a way, these microcosms, very intense, like so much of what he made, and very much structuring the act of looking in an active way. So in other words, his work, particularly here, but I think always, acknowledges the fact that you are looking at it and anticipates that act of regard, and in some way structures it and thematizes it, creates a kind of staged circumstance for your encounter with the object itself. These particular works, like many of his creations, were inspired by historical precedents. And in this case, the precedent is quite clear and quite direct. What he was thinking about are these objects, which are also thought of as prayer beads, sometimes called prayer nuts, and sometimes were in fact carved out of hard nuts, like the kind you would eat. But in this case, it's carved out of boxwood, and that's more commonly what you'll find in the medieval and Renaissance periods. Here's another related piece in the collection in the Metropolitan Museum, which gives you a very strong sense of the ambition, the sheer formal and thematic ambition of these works. As you can see, this is a hinge, but obviously also intended by the carver as a kind of showpiece, a demonstration of skill and a demonstration of ideation. And I think we could say that one thing that interested Attai about these objects and that he tried to instill into his own work is precisely that, the sheer capability of an object to hold incident, to hold detail, to hold formal interest, but also crucially, and I think this is what sets him apart from many other practitioners in any discipline, the capability of an object to bear a certain kind of intellectual weight and really bring all of the possibilities of human thought somehow into a material form and create an encounter on those terms. Very, very difficult to do. One could say maybe the most difficult thing that one could try to do as an artist. And that is what he tried to do all the time. So when he reached back into the historical record with his imagination, he was looking for examples that had that kind of quality of penetration and that intensity of thought. And this is what prompted me to choose the title period I, because that phrase, which comes to us from this art historian you're seeing here, Michael Baxendale, really has to do with a sense that each period, each era, each moment in human history has not only its own particular social context, its own particular events that give rise to and shape experience, but also has its own way of perceiving the world itself. In other words, if we were 12th century or 16th century human beings in a particular culture, we would literally understand what goes on around us in a different way, and it might even in some way look different to us, perhaps in the same way that the world looks different to an animal as opposed to a human. And in fact, we can't know what those differences really amount to. And that was one of the things that Baxendale was particularly interested in. The possibility that if there is such a thing as a period I, then, as you can say here, even marginal differences that stand between us and a historical person, or for that matter, a person from another culture, or you might even say, for that matter, between yourself and any other human, even marginal differences can take on a very curious prominence. In other words, be moments of divergence between ourselves and these other human beings whom we nonetheless want to understand and sympathize with, or empathize with, perhaps would be a better word, and form a connection to. And what Baxendale was trying to do as a general principle in his art historical work is to cross that kind of distance. Now, one of the ways that he did that, which is very interesting to me, because of a lot of the work that I've been doing in craft and design and this idea of material intelligence, which I'm pursuing currently, in fact, editing a journal, a quarterly online journal called Material Intelligence. One possibility that occurred to Baxendale, thinking about how you would construct these cross-historical forays into other people's imaginations, was precisely to think about materiality, because of course material doesn't change in the same sense that a grounded psychological perceptual matrix or framework might change. So this was an animating idea that lay behind his book, The Landward Sculptures of Renaissance Germany, which he wrote when he was a curator at the Victoria and Albert Museum. In fact, I later became a staff member in the research department at the V&A also. And as you can see here, the really foundational premise of this book, which is extremely complex and very learned and connoisseurial in its treatment of the subject, is that limewood was almost like an animate thing. And as you'll see in a second, perhaps literally an animate thing, but just demanded respect and also was something to relate to almost as if you were relating to another human being. So it had a kind of psychological and social freight or gravity of its own. And what Baxendale was interested in doing was to think about the question of excellence in that kind of a framework. So given that there are many artists, craftspeople, artisans, whatever we want to call them, working in this particular medium at this particular time, why do some of these objects lift out of that fabric and continue to mean so much to us all these centuries later? And this is something that Thomas Crow was also very interested in, an art historian that I had the opportunity to work with a little bit when I was in graduate school, and later wrote this book called The Intelligence of Art. I realize I'm showing it to you in a translated edition on the right, but that's just because it's a nicer cover. But it is, of course, available in English. And as you can see here, Crow says that the fundamental aim of Baxendale's book is to address how great episodes in artistic creation come about. So what accounts for these moments of excellence, which of course is exactly the way that I would want to describe Attai. So what is it that accounts for the supreme perceptiveness and grace of Attai's work. And how can we understand that? Well, one way we might understand it is by understanding it in relation to other moments of achievement in art history. And I think that's a lot of what Attai was doing himself. And a great example would be this artist Tilman Riemenschneider, who was active in what is now the northern part of Germany into Flanders in the 16th century. Of course, then the map of Europe looked very different, but very much coming out of that middle or northern European Renaissance tradition. And as you can see, carving works of not only incredible technical expertise, but also a kind of elegance and nuance and sense of particular touch that is very, very haunting, very, very special. And it's a remarkable thing. You can walk past a case of these types of objects, and of which they have many at the V&A, for example, as well as other collections. And invariably, the Riemenschneider will just reach out to you and stop you in your tracks because of its potency. There's just something about it that has a kind of power, I suppose would be the word. And I use that word perhaps advisedly because, of course, the German word for power is Kraft. So this incredible essence instilled into it. Now, Crow, following Baxendale, is this beautiful piece of writing about, here's where the animacy of the wood comes in, about this propensity of wood to break apart if it's not handled properly. Obviously, a metaphor that could easily be seen as analogous to the way that humans respond to being treated well or poorly. And what Crow reads, as it were, between the lines of Baxendale's fairly restrained and very connoisseurial book is this idea that, as you can see here, the sculpture wants to tear itself apart from within. And what I'm showing you there on the right is maybe a little bit hard to read the image, but that's a full-scale figure that's being photographed from the back. And as you can see, it's been scooped out from the inside because, and if you know anything about wood, this will not surprise you, the fluctuations in temperature and moisture will make the wood expand and contract. And if the wood is too thick, even if it's been properly seasoned before it's carved, it will break apart. And star shake is a reference to the fact that that breakage will start as a kind of asterisk-shaped fracture that's right at the heart of the log. So indeed it is called the heartwood, and it will then emanate from there until the sculpture breaks apart. And of course, sometimes we see partial examples of this even in intact sculptures where you get this kind of rift in the surface of a sculpture. That's this action of the sculpture operating against itself, these conflicted internal forces and strains, as Tom Crow says. Now, what's intriguing about this argument in relation to Riemenschneider particularly is that he lived during the period of the Reformation, and in fact his career was ended, not his life, but his career was ended when he, in the very memorable words of a document about this incident, he suffered having his hands broken by iconoclastic Protestant reformers. In other words, people who were religiously moved to attack not only artworks, but also people that made artworks, and wanted to ensure that this masterful, kind of wondrous creator of images would no longer to be able to create his work. And that story, I think, I've never talked to Attai about that story, or for that matter, about Baxendale, but I have a feeling that that's the kind of story that he would have been very, very struck by and would have quietly absorbed and then somehow found a way to bring into his work, either tacitly or explicitly. So this is fantastic example of his work. I'll be showing you a lot of fantastic examples. And as you can see, it very explicitly relates to the idea of ecclesiastical jewelry. So this idea of prayer beads, for example, these wooden turned beads that he's used for hanging the necklace around the neck. And then this very iconically powerful form that indeed looks a little bit like a crucifix, but is actually built out of a found bit of wood, and then has these other bits of wood splayed into it, which he's surfaced in a way that gives them almost the quality of, Bernini's aureole behind the window of the Holy Spirit in the Church of St. Peter's in Rome. So this very strong luminous, explosive image that's contained in this very small space. Such an important part of Attai's work is that quality of compression that he brought to, again, almost everything he made. And I see him here wrestling with the idea of jewelry as an emblematic pursuit, and therefore as something that necessarily, if not being explicitly religious, operates in the same terrain that religion operates in. In other words, the territory of symbolism, the territory of belief or faith might be the better word. And again, the quality of compression that I just mentioned has a sense of containing multitudes within it, and it being brought together in a way that has incredible presence. What the philosopher Walter Benjamin would have called an aura, an auratic value. He was very, very interested in jewelry's power to do that, maybe even more than any other discipline, certainly as much as any painting, any sculpture. Its scale, relation to the body, preciousness, and the way that it fuses together, unlike materials, disparate images, references, historical connotations into this tight, almost clenched fist of an artistic package. That's what he was driven to explore. And then once inside that, he found that it was an infinite landscape that he could traverse through his own creative practice. So that's the overall dimension, and I think gives you something of the sense of what's at stake in Attai's work, and that's really what I want to explore in the talk. Again, the idea of a period eye, but the period in this question, in this case, is our period. So how did he see, and how does that relate to the way that we all see, to varying degrees, like or unlike one another? Just to take a step back into his biography, I'm sure many of you will know his background, but he's Israeli and was trained originally at Bezalel, the great art school there in Jerusalem, where he was from. And I thought it would be appropriate to begin with this work, which is very unusual within his oeuvre, partly because it is so clearly representational and also because it's so explicitly political. And as you can see in this lovely line of Susan Cohn's, it is called D9, which is a reference to a bulldozer that was used by the Israelis to clear Palestinian villages in the process of settlement. And this has obviously become an even more resonant and indeed upsetting subject matter than it was certainly when Attai made this, but even since he died. But, that's a long history, and Attai is somehow bringing all of that to bear in this very haunting, eerie fragment of an object that does show you the side of a bulldozer, earth-moving equipment, but also because of his choice of this olive wood, which is a very strong grain, and also the particular sort of exploratory way, very sensitive way that it's carved, creates the sense that he's looking at this history from a distance and at scale as if it's kind of far away. Obviously, it's a brooch, so it's much, much smaller than the bulldozer that it depicts, which gives you this very strong sense of distance, a kind of perspectival view, which is a very important idea I'll get back to. And also perhaps the approximate contours of the object suggest that we're seeing something in memory, or seeing something as if through the lens of the passage of time and historical reality. So something here about the inability to fully grasp the weight of what it is to be in Israel and to be on the receiving end of this traumatic, tragedy filled, star-crossed history, and how you get that into a single object of this small scale. And yet, at the same time, also very flatly descriptive, very, you might say, restrained, very mild in its way of approaching this extremely vast and difficult topic. So this is where he started, or at least one of the early works that we have of his. What happened next was that he went to Germany to study with Otto Künzli, whose work I'm sure most of you know, who you see here in typically entertaining portrait. And in fact, Attai would make Munich his principal home and place of work up until his death. These are a couple of examples of Künzli's work. and I think give you a very good sense of the perfect marriage of minds that existed between the teacher and his student. So I think particularly the work on the right, the simplicity and humor and devastating effectiveness of simply thinking about a frame as a necklace and a necklace as a frame, and thinking about the way that jewelry creates ornamental context for a human body and transforms them through this very, very simple, clear gesture. And then also on the left, this array of his brooches, which sort of glide in and out of reference to Mickey Mouse, one of his very common references, the whole question of pop art there looming large, but also the question of when an image becomes itself, when something turns from being abstract to representational, what it means to hang a symbol or an emblem on your body, as if you were putting, a nameplate on a door or some other very simple act of identification, and the way that Otto Kunstler will sort of skate in and out of that question of clear legibility, I think made him absolutely the right person for Attai to encounter at that formative period in his career. And it led him, among other things, to making work like this, which, this whole body of work is just so fascinating. And it's actually the first body of work I encountered, because I was able to see the exhibition that he had at in Tel Aviv when he won the Bronfman Prize. And this was sort of the period of that exhibition. That's when I first met him as well. And this whole body of work is so interesting because you can't really tell when you're looking at the pieces. Probably even if you were holding it in your hand, you might not be able to tell what's a found object and what's a made object. So they're very intriguing just on the level of material ontology. In other words, what is it? What is it that you're looking at? What is it that you're holding? What is it that you're putting on your body? Just even that basic first step of encounter with the brooch is already complex and fascinating. But then there are all these other layers, of course. So you have the question of geology and biology. These are these stones and bones, shells, sort of, kind of. They inhabit these classifications of nature, but in some ways they also, again, float free of those classifications as familiar categories that we carry around with us. Again, there's a very strong religious implication, and you might say that this, again, is a piece of evidence of Attai's interest in medieval art, and particularly the idea of the relic. So, you can see here on the one hand Attai's interest, as he says, in a direct encounter with materiality and making that moment of contact, both physical and mental contact with materiality, into something that's narratively rich and has layers and layers of suggestibility to it. And then on the other hand, you can think of these in a totally other way in terms of their relic qualities. So what would they be relics of? What is the narrative that we might associate with them, in the same way that we would associate a certain medieval relic with the story of a saint's life, for example? What about the iconography of them, particularly these that include these ladder-like forms, which here, as you can see, he's very ingeniously using as a way of attaching the work to the body, creating the left hand arm, you could say, of this necklace to create the sense of escape, perhaps, or escalation out of a difficult environment. Or perhaps that's not the right reading of it. Perhaps here's another example of these ladder forms. Perhaps it's more a matter of internal transit. Maybe these objects represent imaginary homes, places that we might think of ourselves as living in, and this is simply the way that we come and go, just like the front door of a house. We just climb in and out of these little bits of our own identity. And as you can see here, another thing Attai said was that every time he made something, he was in some way creating a self-portrait. So shaping his identity through the act of making, and therefore remaking the self as much as he was showing us what he felt his self looked like at that time on that day with these materials in his hands. Continual, unfixed, experimental, imaginative, improvisatory way of thinking about his actual persona as a human being, and the way that he could place that sense of self into a physical artifact and send it on its orbital peregrinations out into the world. Miraculous, really. And this is only the early work. So what happens then is that he becomes more and more technically sophisticated, extremely curious and wide-ranging in his choice of mediums. Also, his exploration of different formats. This is about as conventional as his formats get, you could say, simple oval pendant, not something he did very often, really. But then when you look inside this incredible, detailed landscape that might suggest to you, again, a Northern Renaissance source like the landscapes of Albrecht Altdorfer. If you know that name, he was actually the very first European landscape painter. So if you don't know Albrecht Altdorfer, it might be worth a look. Or, the landscapes that you would see in the back of a Jan van Eyck or another Northern Renaissance painter. This particular pendant has a fascinating title, which is Menin Road. And what you're seeing on the left is actually a depiction of the blasted battlefield at Menin Road. And the battle in question occurred in 1917 during World War I. On the right, you see another version of this landscape, or perhaps a different vantage point. It's the rear of the same object. And again, very redolent of a historic Dutch landscape painting. I thought it would be interesting to show you this painting. I'm not sure actually if Attai knew it, but this is by Paul Nash, and the British artist, and was made after World War I, and kind of retrospective look back at the war. And I think you can see something of the same quality of haunted, its own way, a kind of post-landscape or post-apocalyptic landscape, not a site that's any more about human habitation, but simply about the inscription of violence on the ground. And if you don't mind me giving you a little reading recommendation, I'll just here parenthetically suggest that you have a look at this wonderful book by Laura Cummings, which is called Thunderclap, which is about an incident that, again, I don't think most people know about, but the little town of Delft, which we all know from its blue and white ceramics, which incidentally Attai might be quoting here, that blue and white palette. It was actually destroyed by an explosion of a gunpowder store in the 17th century. And it left a landscape that looked a lot like this. And there are amazing paintings and engravings of that. And again, I wonder whether some of that might have been playing in Attai's mind, but certainly this idea of a kind of devastation and what it means to an artist to encounter that was obviously something that was right front and center for him. Again, think of the bulldozer, think of the way that he's surrounded by this contested landscape as he's growing up in Jerusalem. So at any rate, I do really recommend that book, Laura Cummings' Thunderclap, as something to read while ideally having a piece of Attai's on your lapel or around your neck. I think that would be a great way of connecting with him. However, the Nash, as I said, is not something that Attai specifically related to that work. This, however, is something that he did post to his Instagram. This is a Magritte, and it's called Drifting in the Sky. And is an atypical work of Magritte's. We're more used to him showing us human figures in various configurations with or without apples on their faces. And this is more almost Escher-like, you could say, but has the same strange airlessness and, of course, the deep quizzical surrealism that we associate with the great Belgian master of riddling paintings. And this is something that I know Attai loved, and I'm not surprised that he responded to it so much. Maybe the thing that would have most attracted to him, I can imagine, is the little fort or miniature city castle that sits atop the mountain, and the idea that there would be people in that city and that they would be living up there on this boulder that floats above the surf and looking down the vast splayed plains of the top of that rock mass and gazing down at this unreachable ocean below. And what would that life be like? Makes me think of Italo Calvino as well, the Italian author. And so this kind of gives you the headspace of a work like Menin Road. It also made me think of another artist, incidentally, who's Karolina Sluta, who's not a jeweler, but a ceramist, but Finnish artist who makes these beautiful carved away ceramic plates. And as I said, I think that's a very important reference for this body of work that Attai made. So here, what you're looking at is a plate that actually starts as an antique object, and then Karolina will very, very carefully erase a layer of the surface and sort of almost bleach it away, as it were. She's actually physically carving it with a rotating tool, like a Dremel tool, among other implements. But getting to this kind of this quality of discovery, a kind of excavation of these quiet moments of meaning. And this particular plate, which already had these incredible stains that had soaked into it through its cracked glaze, she carved away and then just left this one sculpted version of one little bit of the architecture that was on the original landscape scene of the plate. And it reminds me so much of the Magritte, the top of the boulder there, and then this amazing little finding, and then the way that Attai would find the same qualities of uninhabitable habitation in his work. So then the next thing that happens is that Attai discovers paper. So if you only know one body of his work, I'm going to guess this is what you know, because it's the last body of work that he made, and he also created a huge and prolific oeuvre in this material. As he says, as he says here in this quote, he was very moved by all of the things that he could do with it. So it was not just that it was cheap and available and allowed for a kind of precision. It was not just that it had an extremely diverse palette that sort of came for free, if you like, unlike with metals and gemstones and other jewelry materials. But it was also that it had this kind of metamorphic capability, almost like something out of Ovid. It was a material that could be made to look like anything. And of course, it's also very interesting that paper is the material of language. It's the material of printing, of publishing. It's the material of the Gutenberg Bible. It's the material of ideas, of communication. At least it has been up until very recently, with our digital so-called paperless revolution, which again is something I'll talk about more in just a second. But the thing that absorbed Attai the most in his work in paper proved to be this question of perspective that I mentioned earlier. I think he was very interested in the whole question, not just of looking, but looking at a piece of jewelry and looking at a person who is wearing a piece of jewelry. And the idea that when you look in that way, again, this is the idea of the period I perhaps being applied. When you look at somebody, as it were, through the conceptual framework of the jewelry that they're wearing, what you're getting is a non-perspectival view of that person. In other words, a view that's not about clarity, rationality within a grid, a certain orthogonal, mathematical, coordinated placement within a larger geometric matrix, but rather had a kind of situatedness, personalism, psychological specificity, and therefore incredible complexity that the grid, so beloved of the Renaissance, as you can see here, would not have. And here we can return to Baxendale, in fact, who, in his book Painting an Experience in Renaissance Italy, wrote about humanism, the Renaissance interest in literature and philology, broadly speaking, the idea that you could reshape intellectual life so that it is centered on the human experience rather than an experience that's imposed from above by divinity or lies outside of the human because of its groundedness in nature. So this, of course, would be the same idea. The kind of iconic emblem in this case would be the Vitruvian Man of Leonardo, of course. But Baxendale said in general, and here I'm just showing a Giotto, an earlier Renaissance painting on the right, that it was very interesting that humanism constructed a kind of parallel universe that was independent of verification against unliterary experience. And what he means by that is that it seemed to run alongside humanist language and discourse, seemed to run alongside our sensual and tactile and, as I say, grounded experience of the world, and instead to be almost purely held within the mind, almost to the point that it became a kind of fiction, a kind of a feat of imagination. And if we're looking for another emblem of that, we might shift just slightly to one side of Leonardo and look at Raphael in the School of Athens, this famous painting in the Vatican, which, as I'm sure you know, has this depiction of the philosophers of ancient Athens in it. And you have right in the center Aristotle there in the blue cloak, and to his left, Plato in his pink and purple robes. And Plato is pointing up with his finger because he's a believer in the transcendental forms and the idea that all truth somehow exists outside and above the human realm and cannot be accessed by us. And Aristotle is holding his hand out flat and parallel to the plane of the earth, to suggest that philosophy's proper enterprise is to explore and understand that which lies around us through empirical discovery and analysis. And what Baxendale would say about this painting, I guess, is that neither of these perspectives actually accounts for the, as it were, real quality of experience that actually presents itself to us on a day-by-day basis. The experience of eating, of defecating, of sexuality, of pain, of pleasure. It's almost as if it's this philosophical legacy, which of course shapes so much of European history, intellectual history. It's almost as if this philosophical legacy had from its onset already achieved a kind of orbital takeoff from the everyday concerns of the human embodied subjectivity. And of course, therefore, the fact that Raphael is presenting this right at the central vanishing point of this extremely insistent perspectival representation of this architecture, this imaginary architecture, is extremely apt. And what Attai was thinking about, and here I hope you're getting a sense of the very deep stakes that he was engaged with intellectually, and also the quality of his thinking about this and the level of literacy and quizzical intelligence that he brought to the act of making. Because this is not just me saying he's interested in these things, that he really was. You know, we talked about it, and this was if you like, just as much the material that he was working with when he created his work as paper was. He was interested in creating a kind of object and a kind of looking that did not sit within this paradigm, but rather pointed in other directions, maybe lots of directions at the same time. So this is a great example of these works in paper that he created, which you could very much say skew away from that humanist, rationalist perspectival tradition, just as much as, let's say, Cubism did in its time. Here, a collage by Brock, you know, the question of how you represent a tabletop with a newspaper and maybe a cup and a chessboard on it and daily papers. You know, how does one represent that? How many ways are there to represent that? Is pictorial representation subject to the same kind of research that other intellectual enterprises might be, rather than being simply an intuitive or formal act of transcription of what's seen? So is this a period I that we're seeing here, the period of the 19-teens? And then when we return to Attai's work, how much is this like Cubism in its palette, obviously, in its fragmentary collagiste or bricolaged structure, in its teasing referentiality to maybe, again, to newspapers, but certainly also to feathers, to gemstones, or maybe even just mathematical shapes like fractals. How much is this like Cubism, and how much is it like something totally different that the Cubists could never have imagined? And of course, I think the answer is both, because he is learning from all of those traditions, but he's also operating in a period which, as I alluded to before, is going paperless, is going hands-off, is becoming digital, is becoming virtual, is becoming the experiential domain of the online. And to me, it's very interesting and I think necessary to understand these works as conditioned by that virtual experience, not just the fact of, you know, spending our days connecting with the wider world through the remote control of an internet browser, but also, you know, things like film special effects, let's say, or deep fakes or manipulation of images, the kind of distortion field that we all exist in all the time and have gotten to be or need to get to be more and more adept at reading. That was the context in which he was making these images. And I think the other thing that he brought to that was a very keen sense, a jeweler's keen sense of theatricality. And in fact, he used the phrase "all the world's a stage" from Shakespeare's "As You Like It" as the group title for this group of paper works. I'm showing you there a 19th century bill for Romeo and Juliet rather than "As You Like It," just because I think it so perfectly approximates the kind of, in a way, histrionic ridiculousness that happens in theater. People behaving in ways that are exaggerated, mannered, ways that they would actually never behave in real life, but somehow read more truly to us across the impassable plane of the proscenium, from the stage to the audience. And when Attai really got going on these ideas and started to bring color back into his work, he created these unbelievable microcosms that were all of that. They are the stage. They are the stage of Shakespeare of 500 years ago, but they're also the stage of right now. They're the virtual space, again, compressed into this amazing, heaving, destabilized, but tiny physical artifact. And so here we see Attai at his best, and then we see him here again in this more cup-like version of the object with its strange, almost railway-like or fence-like appendage, and the perhaps more explicitly landscape references of the sea and the grass, the rocky crags. And we see it again and again in these works that he was making towards the end of his life, so deep and so fully realized, and somehow requiring no particular interpretation like what I'm trying to do for you right now, and yet being able to absorb as much interpretation as you want to bring to them, and yet inviting more and more. They seem absolutely impossible to use up either with your eyes or with your brain. They just have an incredible capability to draw out of you your own imaginative associations. And I think that's because what he had put that into them from himself in the first place. Just to underline the point that he's working against the backdrop of this digital stage, this stage that one can't actually stand on, but is constantly being projected against or into. I thought it might be interesting to mention Hito Steyerl's work. She's perhaps best known as an artist, but also a great writer, and did an essay that really did the rounds of art schools a few years ago about the concept of the poor image. It's called In Defense of the Poor Image. And what she's talking about are these kind of crappy JPEGs and GIFs that fly around the internet and on our phones, kind of one step up from an emoji. And more generally, the fact that in these broken down, dilapidated images, as she calls them, you have the kind of apex experience in some way, or maybe the nadir experience of what it is to be a digital looker, to have our period eye, the eye that's conditioned by the virtual, and this beautiful line that the stable and single point of view, which is obviously the point of view represented in that Raphael that I showed you. The stable and single point of view, as it were, with the vanishing point, is being supplemented and often replaced by multiple perspectives, overlapping windows, distorted flight lines, and divergent vanishing points. And if you're interested in this particular shift from the perspectival to the virtual, I will direct you to the essay that Patty asked me to write for the book about Attai that's coming out, where I go much further into this question of perspective, particularly in relation to another art historian who was very important to Baxendal, who was called Erwin Panofsky, who wrote about the question of perspective as a culturally relative phenomenon. So here, just coming towards the end of my talk, when we look at these staged works that are themselves stages, in other words, theatricalized spaces that also present themselves to you in a dramatic way, as only jewelry can do, better than anything else, as I said, we might think about his achievement in the larger framework, art historically speaking. So we might think about him in relation to other artists who designed for the stage, like Osamu Noguchi, here working with Martha Graham in these amazing kind of neo-surrealistic sculptures that, again, are both abstract and representational at the same time as Attai's work was. We might think about other jewelers like Carl Fritsch, who, again, really were able to put their finger on what it was to ornament, and how that process, which has such a reputation for being trivial, could actually become one of the most poignant and fraught of artistic undertakings. Reminds me a little bit of Alessandro Mendini's, the great postmodern designer Alessandro Mendini once said, there's nothing more profound than superficiality. And I think that's a great way of thinking about both Attai's work and Carl Fritzsch's work in jewelry. But then we might also think about him in relation to, Frank Stella or other artists who were literally exploding the picture plane and thinking about painting in a totally new way through three-dimensionality, through bricolage, again, through, I think postmodern would be a good word for this, through a kind of infinite regress of points of view, so that there is no stable, not just stable point of view, but no stable standpoint. In other words, you feel like you're constantly being displaced or pushed around by Stella's work in whatever medium it was made. I thought you might be interested to see these very fascinating ceramic reliefs that he made for a very short period of time in the 1980s. Well, he didn't make them. The guy on the left, who's called Frank Bosco, made them, but Frank Stella designed these, and Bosco, who was a trained ceramist, rendered them for him, you might say. And again, I see a very strong relationship between this work and what Attai was doing towards the end of his career, towards the end of his life. This is a very singular example from his show Pars Pro Toto, which means the part standing in for the whole. It's the same idea as the idea of a synecdoche, if you know that slightly geeky 50-cent word. So part stands in for the whole. And again, a really great way of thinking about the shift in representational regimes that Attai was engaged in. In other words, rather than showing you the clear window on the world as a Renaissance picture would, he wants to get at the world by giving you a piece of it, maybe lots of pieces, fragmentary, nested inside one another. And this amazing sprawling wall work, which you can see here, just to give you a sense of scale, this installation to Pars Pro Toto, looking perhaps like feathers or petals of flowers or mountainscapes, ocean waves all swirling together in this amazing kind of vortex. Just gives you a sense of the sheer potential that still lay before him. And I guess the only way that we can end in any discussion about Attai now is with sadness, because we will never get to see the things that he would have made if he had had the life before him that he ought to have, another 30, 40 years of making. At his level, one can only imagine what he would have achieved and what that would have meant, not only for him personally and for all of us who loved him, but also for the field and indeed for the whole nature of human understanding through art. I guess I thought it would be appropriate, instead of closing with words of my own, to close with the words of his teacher, Otto Kunstli, who wrote this amazing piece for a catalog, actually, the catalog for that Bronfman show that I mentioned earlier, when he encountered this brooch, and Attai showed it to him. And maybe what I'll do is just read this very short quote, which was recirculated on the occasion of Attai's passing, but I think is very apposite here, and maybe is another lens that we can use to look at his work. So Kunstli says, "The white color and the cloud-like form appease the gaze only at first sight, for this is neither a cotton ball nor a falling feather. For all its appeal, this tangled ball's cracked bark also has something dark and oppressive about it. It is an impenetrable agglomerate, a rampant form of growth, at once fascinating, alluring, and threatening. I see a struggle, pain, and desperation, and from deep within, a warm light emerges." Thank you very much.